Is less than. The dollar was wet before it even left his hand. Rain hammered the sidewalk in sheets, and Daniel stood frozen at the curb, staring at the last bill in his wallet, watching it curl in the wind like it already knew what he was about to do. Cars blurred past, splashing gutter water onto his shoes. Horns screamed. Somewhere behind him, a siren rose and faded, and across the street, huddled beneath a broken bus stop with no roof left to keep the storm out, an old woman shook so hard her teeth clicked together. Nobody looked at her. Not once. Dozens of people walked by in the space of a minute, and every single one of them found somewhere else to put their eyes. She had become furniture. She had become nothing. Daniel had $11 to his name that morning. He had 9 now. And in his hand was the last one, damp and shaking, and every rational part of him screamed that he needed it more than she did. He had rent due. He had a daughter he hadn't seen in 3 weeks because he couldn't afford the bus fare to visit her. He had absolutely nothing left to give, and yet his feet were already moving. He crossed against the light. A cab blared its horn and swerved, and he didn't even flinch. He knelt down in front of her, rain soaking through his knees, and held out the crumpled dollar like it was something precious. "I'm sorry," he said. "It's not much." She looked up at him. Her eyes were pale, almost silver in the streetlight, and for a moment Daniel felt like she was looking straight through his skin into something underneath. She didn't reach for the money right away. She studied his face like she was memorizing it. Then she took the dollar, and her fingers wrapped around his hand instead of just the bill. "Kindness always finds its way home," she whispered. Daniel didn't know what to say to that. He nodded, gave her a small, awkward smile, and walked back into the rain, already thinking about how he was going to explain to his landlord that he had nothing left to give him either. He had no idea that a black car had slowed at the corner. He had no idea that a man inside it had lifted a phone to his ear and said 4 words that would change everything. "It's happening again." He had no idea that by sunset the next day, his entire life would be unrecognizable. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was this woman, really? Why was she sitting in the freezing rain when a phone call from her could summon a fleet of cars? And out of every person who had walked past her that night, why did she choose to test Daniel? Stay until the end, because everyone in this story believed one thing about their life, right up until the truth destroyed it completely. To understand what happened next, you have to understand who Daniel really was. He was 36 years old, and he cleaned office buildings for a living, starting at 11 at night and finishing when the sun came up. His wife had died 4 years earlier, and after that, his world had quietly collapsed around him, piece by piece, bill by bill, until there was nothing left to hold on to except his daughter, Mia, who was 7 years old and living with her aunt because Daniel couldn't afford to feed her the way she deserved. He hated that arrangement more than he hated anything. Every night he mopped floors under fluorescent lights, he thought about her. Every dollar he earned, he mentally split in half before it even hit his bank account rent and Mia. There was never anything left over, not for himself, not for anything. His coworkers thought he was strange. He gave his lunch away more than he ate it. He stayed late to help the new guy learn the routes, even though it cost him sleep. Once a coworker named Frank watched him hand his last $5 to a kid outside the building, who said he needed bus fare, and Frank just shook his head. "Kindness doesn't pay bills, man," Frank said. Daniel shrugged and kept walking. "It helps me sleep." That was the thing about Daniel. He wasn't naive. He knew people took advantage of him sometimes. He knew the math never worked in his favor, but something in him refused to become hard. His wife used to say that the world doesn't need more people counting their coins, it needs more people who remember what the coins are for. He hadn't forgotten, even when it cost him everything. Meanwhile, on the streets a few blocks from his apartment, there was a woman everyone called the street ghost. Nobody knew her real name. She had worn the same gray coat for as long as anyone could remember. She never begged loudly, never made a scene, never explained herself to anyone. She simply existed at the edges of the city, watching. And that was the strange part. She watched people the way a scientist watches a reaction in a dish. Not desperate, not pleading, studying. Some nights she sat near the train station for hours and never asked a single soul for money. She just observed who stopped, who looked away, who sped up their walk to avoid her eyes. Nobody knew that inside that gray coat was a woman who could have bought the entire block she was sitting on, twice over, without blinking. 3 days after the rainstorm, everything in Daniel's life fell apart at once. His shift supervisor called him into a cramped office and told him the cleaning contract had been cut. No warning, no severance, just gone. Daniel stood there holding his final paycheck, doing the math in his head, and the math didn't work no matter how many times he ran it. That evening, his landlord was waiting outside his apartment door. 3 days, the landlord said. 3 days or I change the locks. Daniel nodded because there was nothing else to say. Inside, he opened his refrigerator and found exactly what he expected to find: nothing. Not a scrap. He checked his wallet. $1. One single crumpled dollar between him and absolute zero. His phone buzzed. It was his sister, texting him a photo of Mia at the park, laughing on a swing, her hair flying behind her. Daniel stared at that photo for almost a full minute, his throat tightening, his hand gripping the dollar bill so hard it nearly tore. He put on his jacket and walked outside. The audience watching this story might expect that this is the moment Daniel finally puts himself first. He has $1 left. He has nothing. Surely now, he keeps it. Instead, he walked 3 blocks in the cold to the bus stop where he'd first seen her. And there she was again, same gray coat, same silver eyes, shivering against the metal bench. He knelt down in front of her and pressed the dollar into her palm. She stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You have nothing. I can see it on you. Why would you give me the last of it?" Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Because if I were you," he said, "I'd pray that someone would help me." The old woman's eyes filled with tears so fast it startled him. She turned her face away, pressing the back of her hand to her mouth, and for a long moment she didn't say anything at all. She wasn't crying because of the dollar. Money had stopped meaning anything to her decades ago. She was crying because in all the years she had done this, all the years she had sat on cold benches and empty sidewalks testing the hearts of strangers, nobody had ever answered her question that way. Nobody had ever flipped it around and shown her their own fear, their own hope, their own desperate faith that someone, somewhere, might do the same for them. Daniel gave a small nod, shoved his hands into his empty pockets, and walked away into the dark, completely unaware that a black luxury SUV had pulled to the curb 30 feet behind him. 2 men in tailored suits stepped out and approached the old woman with quiet urgency, speaking to her in low voices, glancing toward Daniel's retreating figure. He never turned around. He never saw them at all. If this story is touching your heart, comment, "Kindness still matters." I'd love to know who's still watching. The days that followed were the darkest of Daniel's life. The eviction notice came on a Tuesday, taped to his door in bright red ink. He packed what little he owned into 2 garbage bags and moved into his car, an old sedan with a cracked windshield and a heater that barely worked. He hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days. His phone was down to 8% battery, and he had no charger, no outlet, nowhere to plug it in. He sat in the driver's seat one night, hands on the wheel, and for the first time since his wife died, he let himself cry. Not quiet tears, real, shaking sobs, the kind that come from somewhere so deep you can't control them. He thought about Mia. He thought about the promises he'd made her, that he'd get back on his feet, that they'd be together soon, that things would get better. He whispered into the dark, "Where are you? Why does it feel like nobody's listening?" His friends stopped calling. Frank texted once to check in, then went silent. His neighbors, the ones who used to wave at him in the hallway, now crossed the street when they saw him standing near his car. People do that. They pull away from struggle like it's contagious. What Daniel didn't know was that, at that exact moment, 40 floors above the city, in a boardroom made of glass and dark wood, a group of executives sat around a long table, watching his photograph on a massive screen. "He passed," one of them said quietly. Another leaned forward. "Are we absolutely certain? This has to be beyond doubt." "He gave away his last dollar twice," the first executive replied. "Once when he had $11 left, once when he had one. He had no idea who she was. He wasn't performing for anyone. There was nobody there to impress." A long silence settled over the room, because what none of them said out loud, what everyone in that boardroom already understood, was that this had happened before. Many times. Over many years, the woman in the gray coat had tested thousands of people across dozens of cities. She had sat on freezing benches and dusty corners, disguised, watching who stopped and who didn't. Most people ignored her completely. Some had insulted her, told her to get a job, told her she was a waste of space on the sidewalk. A handful over all those years had stolen from her, reaching into the small bag she carried, taking the little bit of change she kept for the act, disappearing into the crowd without a second glance. Only a rare few had ever helped her. And of those, almost every single one had done it because someone else was watching, a friend nearby, a camera on a storefront, an audience that made kindness convenient. Daniel was different. Daniel had given everything he had on a rain-soaked street corner with absolutely nobody around to see it. And then he had done it again 3 days later, when he had nothing left at all. He hadn't given because someone was watching. He had given because nobody was. For the next several days, investigators, because that's truly what they were, quietly built a complete picture of Daniel's life. His late wife, his daughter living with relatives, his years of unpaid overtime helping coworkers, the lunch money he'd given away, the $5 for a stranger's bus fare, pattern after pattern of the same thing, over and over, with no reward attached to any of it. It was time for the truth to come out. The truth was this. The woman in the gray coat was not homeless. She had never been homeless a single day in her adult life. Her name, though almost no one outside that boardroom had spoken it aloud in years, belonged to one of the most powerful business empires on the continent. Hotels, shipping, technology, philanthropy stretching across 4 countries. She had inherited it from her husband after he passed away unexpectedly. And then, only 2 years later, she had lost her only son in an accident that the newspapers had covered for exactly 1 week before the world moved on and forgot. She hadn't forgotten, she never would. In the aftermath of that loss, something in her had shattered and then hardened into a single, unshakable belief that wealth had blinded almost everyone around her. Employees who smiled at her only because of her name. Business partners who called themselves friends but vanished the moment a deal fell through. She had grown so certain that genuine human decency was disappearing from the world that she made a decision nobody around her understood at the time. She would disappear into it. She would put on an old gray coat, sit on freezing benches, and search not for employees, not for investors, not for people who wanted something from her, but for one thing only: proof. Proof that somewhere out there, kindness still existed without a price tag attached to it. For years, she found almost nothing. Coin after coin ignored, insult after insult, almost enough to confirm what she already feared, that she'd been right to give up on people. And then came Daniel. The invitation arrived at his car window on a gray Thursday morning, delivered by a man in a suit who somehow knew exactly where to find him. Daniel stared at the heavy cream envelope in his lap for a long time before opening it, certain it had to be a mistake, certain someone had the wrong person entirely. Inside was a single line: "Please come, she's waiting." He almost didn't go. He nearly crumpled the letter and tossed it aside, assuming it was some kind of scam preying on people who had nothing left to lose. But something about the handwriting, elegant, careful, oddly familiar, made him fold it gently instead and put it in his jacket pocket. The car that picked him up an hour later was the nicest thing he'd ever sat inside. He kept his hands folded tightly in his lap the entire ride, terrified of touching anything, certain he'd be asked to leave any moment. When the gates finally opened, he thought at first they'd made a wrong turn. It wasn't a house, it was an estate, stone and glass. Fountains catching the afternoon light, a driveway longer than the block he used to live on. Daniel stepped out of the car on legs that didn't feel entirely his own. The front doors opened, and there she stood. Except she wasn't the woman from the bus stop anymore. Her gray coat was gone. In its place was a simple, tailored dress, her silver hair pulled back, her posture entirely different, straighter, stronger, unmistakably someone who commanded every room she'd ever walked into. But her eyes, those same pale, searching eyes, hadn't changed at all. Daniel froze at the bottom of the steps. Behind her, an entire row of staff stood in complete silence, watching him the way you'd watch someone who had just won something they didn't know they'd entered. "You," he said, his voice barely working. "We've been waiting," she said gently. Daniel's knees nearly gave out. He looked around at the fountains, the staff, the impossible scale of everything in front of him, and felt something between shock and grief rising in his chest. "I don't understand," he whispered. "I gave you $1. I didn't have anything else to give." She stepped down toward him, close enough that he could see the tears gathering again in her eyes, exactly like the night on the bench. "You gave me your last $1, she said, "twice, when you had every reason in the world to keep it." She paused, her voice trembling now. "But what you actually gave me, Daniel, was something I had almost stopped believing existed. Proof that goodness is still real. Proof that it doesn't need an audience to survive. If you're still watching up to now, type "I'm still here" in the comments section. What happened next unfolded slower than Daniel expected, and far more carefully. She didn't hand him a check and send him on his way. She sat him down instead, in a quiet room lined with books, and told him everything: her husband, her son, the years on cold benches, the thousands of people she'd watched come and go without ever seeing her. Then she asked him a question that changed the direction of his entire life. "What would you do," she said, "if you had the resources to help people the way you always wished someone would help you?" Daniel didn't have to think long. He talked about Mia. He talked about single parents working 3 jobs and still falling behind. He talked about people one missed paycheck away from living in their car, the way he had. He spoke for almost 20 minutes without stopping, and she listened to every word without once interrupting him. By the end of that conversation, she offered him something far greater than money. She offered him a leadership role inside her charitable foundation, not as a token gesture, not as a photo opportunity, but as someone who would help decide where real resources went, someone who understood exactly what it felt like to have nothing left to give and give it anyway. She paid off every debt he carried. She restored the apartment he'd lost. And within a week, Mia was back in his arms. And for the first time in years, Daniel didn't have to explain to his daughter why he couldn't be there. But the greatest gift wasn't the money, and it wasn't the house, and it wasn't even his daughter coming home, as enormous as that was. The greatest gift was trust, the simple, radical decision of one woman to believe in one man because he had proven, without ever knowing he was being tested, that he was exactly who he appeared to be. Years passed. The foundation grew under Daniel's guidance into something that touched thousands of families every single year. Rent assistance for parents on the edge, emergency funds for people who had just lost their jobs, scholarships for kids like Mia who deserved a future their parents couldn't yet afford. Daniel made sure every single program was built the way he wished someone had helped him, quietly, with dignity, without making anyone feel small for needing it. One small act on a rainy street corner, repeated once more when he had nothing left at all, had rippled outward into thousands of lives he would never even meet. The greatest rewards rarely come to those chasing wealth. They tend to find the people whose hearts remain generous, even when their pockets are completely empty, the ones who give not because someone is watching, but because nobody is. A person's true wealth was never measured by what they managed to keep. It was measured by what they were willing to give away when they had almost nothing left to give. If you had only $1 left in the entire world, would you have given it away? Tell us honestly in the comments below. And if this story reminded you that kindness still exists in this world, subscribe for more unforgettable stories of hope, mystery, and the quiet moments that end up changing lives forever. Because the next story we tell you might challenge everything you believe about luck, destiny, and the extraordinary power of one simple choice.